For the first 5 hours of Beasts of Reincarnation, I was not sold. It's a game with poor tutorialization and opaque world building, and this slow and distant tone that made me start to wonder if Game Freak was maybe out of their depth with this one. 5 hours later, and I found myself completely hooked. All of a sudden, its combat evolved into a frenetic but fair series of intertwining systems. Its world became more interesting as I started to explore every edge of it, and it put me into the headspace of its protagonist, Emma, as she slowly shifted from a societal outcast with no understanding of the outside world into a character with agency and a home, and most importantly, a family. It's a game that explores deep emotions and takes those emotions seriously, and it may sound sappy, but Beasts of Reincarnation is sappy in the same way a lot of its influences are. It's Nier Automata by way of Princess Mononoke. It's Final Fantasy VII by way of Death Stranding, and there's not a lick of Pokemon to be found in here. And thank God for that, honestly. I think a lot of people are going to talk about this game in the context of Pokemon, which makes a lot of sense because Game Freak is best known for making the Pokemon games, but the Pokemon games are also seen as a franchise that's kind of in decline. People really tend to not resonate, at least the people you see talking the loudest on the internet, tend to not resonate with Pokemon games as much these days, and I think a lot of people have their eyes trained on Beasts of Reincarnation to just know if Game Freak is capable of making a quote-unquote good video game or not. I think the things that make this game interesting, though, are the same exact things that will make it ammunition for both sides of this argument. Just get ready for a bunch of reactionary clickbaity YouTubers to make some videos that are titled Flop of Reincarnation or Game Freak is still great and has been great forever, etc. The truth about this game is that while the context about its developer is interesting and definitely worth considering, it should not be the focus of your time with Beasts of Reincarnation. You should not go into this game trying to prove a point about Pokemon. Consider Beasts of Reincarnation on its own merit. Judge it by its own intention. What did Game Freak set out to make, and did they accomplish that? Don't fall into that trap, dear viewer. A lot of people are going to try to pull you into that trap. So what did Game Freak make? That's the interesting question. Beasts of Reincarnation is an action-adventure game set in the year 4026 after the titular Beasts of Reincarnation spread a blight across the land, transforming plants and animals into cursed and mutated creatures known as malefacts. You play as a character named Emma, who is a blighted human who's been cast out from society. She's kind of been kept at arm's length, though. It's because she has the power of purification, which means that when she defeats a blighted creature or being, she can absorb that blight and remove it from the world. So the people who live in the settlement nearby hate her guts for being blighted, but also need her to protect them so they can continue living their lives as normal. Emma's job is to head out into this post-apocalyptic version of Japan and take out these giant malefacts called Nushi, which are lording over each region, as she makes her way towards the capital city where the Beast of Reincarnation is supposed to show up, and then she can defeat it once and for all and end 2,000 years of blight. You get the idea. So you spend your time wandering around these open zones looking for the Nushi that lords over the region, fighting these kind of smaller malefacts along with corrupted golems, and when you feel like you've pushed out far enough, or you need to take a break, or you've collected enough items that you want to use for something or other, you can return back to the Cleanse Walker, which is your mobile home that you traverse this space with. While you're there, you can grow some crops, you can raise some chickens, you can chat with your companions, you can make a meal, you can tend to your swords and all of that stuff. You can shower all the blood and guts off of yourself and your dog, and then you go to sleep and you wake up and you do it all the next day. That's the loop of the game. You continue doing that until you have found each region's Nushi, taken it down, moved on to the next region, lather, rinse, repeat. And I will say, on the first loop of this in Chapter 1, it didn't work for me at all, 0%. A lot of that came down to the game's extremely dour atmosphere, because Beasts of Reincarnation is a game that takes itself seriously and wants you to also take it seriously, and it expresses that by having these extremely slowly paced cutscenes with a lot of characters basically unable to express any kind of emotion whatsoever, not being upfront with one another, not telling each other anything about the world or the story or the narrative, which leaves you, the player, basically totally in the dark for around 5 hours, maybe even more, depending on how long it takes you to get through Chapter 1. I'm not against this kind of story, to be clear. Stories can take themselves seriously, but usually you have some kind of levity in the mix, like a character who's a little bit out there or a little bit wacky or fun to have on screen. But that's not really a thing that Beast of Reincarnation is interested in for a while. There are fun characters who will show up down the line, but not for a little bit. So it really just kind of comes down to like poor execution, I would say, because generally speaking, the game is not very good at explaining itself, and that comes from the narrative and also the game's mechanics. And truth be told, like, this is the thing that will stop people in their tracks, and people will walk away from this game and say Beast of Reincarnation is not good, it's mid, it's bad, whatever, because of their time with the first chapter. The first 5 hours, I think, are pretty tough to get through. That said, those who push past it will be rewarded, because I am much higher on this game than I was in my first 5 hours. In fact, I think it's great. Surprise, surprise. Once I got into the second chapter, characters just started opening up more about like their reason for existing and doing the things that they were doing. And the combat suddenly had a lot more optionality to it. And I started to get a better sense of who Emma was and why she was doing the things she was doing and why I was doing the things that I needed to be doing to continue progressing the plot. This actually sent me down a very specific path, which is the thing that unlocked the whole game for me, which is I went back to the first region again. I had unlocked the second region, but I went backwards to the first region, and I was like, I'm going to spend more time here. I'm going to poke at the world's edges. I'm going to explore more with this added context I have about what's going on in the world and where these robotic golems came from and just everything that I knew about the game. And boy, did it change my opinion, like pretty dramatically. Like just while I was there, for example, I started to get a better handle on Emma's traversal ability. She has this incredible ability where if you hold down X, you just launch yourself into the air because, again, Emma is blighted. Her braid turns from hair into branches and plant life, and she can control that hair kind of like Bayonetta style, so she can launch herself high into the air, and if you do that over an enemy, you can press R1 and like plunge your katana into its head, and that's always sick. In every video game that's ever been in, that's sick. But you can also like extend bridges outwards. You can use your hair as like a grappling hook to certain points around the map as well, and I just started like really loving running around these open spaces, using all these abilities and tying them together and like kind of getting into and out of skirmishes with the different factions of enemies along the way. So exploration itself just started to yield more rewards as the world became more interesting than ever to me. The unexplained ruins of sub-cities I kept coming across kind of implied like 2,000 years ago, humanity was afraid of the Beast of Reincarnation showing up and then fled underground and lived underground for a long while. Giant, dead, rusting, robotic golems also implied that there might have been some kind of battle, which I think humanity ended up losing. And there are a lot of moments where you'll be wandering around these open zones and you'll find that blighted beasts will walk into areas where golems are patrolling, and they'll just start to fight each other, which is a way that the game is kind of teaching you about its world through its interacting systems. It turns out that Curiosity was actually a much better tutorial than the one that's present in the video game, which kind of puts it in line with some of my favorite games of all time, which I know is kind of a... I'm not saying that this is one of my favorite games of all time. I'm just saying it's not unlike a lot of the things I love about some of my favorite games of all time. Do you follow? Like, the question of was this intentional on Game Freak's part doesn't matter as much as your own experience playing the thing. And I have found that running around this open world and exploring it for myself and poking at its edges reminds me of things like Dragon's Dogma. And then when you wrap up an excursion and you come back to the Cleansewalker, that's kind of where you get the Death Stranding of it all as well. This is where you're raising chickens and crops, which will allow you to make new recipes, which kind of give you Monster Hunter style buffs as you go out onto your next excursion. But increasingly, as the characters on the Cleansewalker start to open up to one another, it gives you this like emotional reprieve from how dour and down the rest of the world is. And Emma herself starts to change over the course of the journey as well. She's kind of thrown into this journey with really no say in the matter, and when she starts asking questions about it, guess what? It starts to become more interesting. But pretty quickly after its first chapter, once I got into this loop, this go out into the world, explore all of the edges, find all of its secrets, go find the Nushi, fight the Nushi, come back to the Cleansewalker, chat with everybody else, like that loop started to become so compelling that I stopped thinking of this game as like a homework assignment I'd kind of given myself so I could make this video. And I started to like really genuinely love it. Like I really had a great time with this video game. The combat itself also starts to get significantly more interesting. I think this game is going to get compared to Sekiro a lot because it has a strong focus on parrying, and there are posture meters that will break, and then enemies will be kind of, stunned while they regain their posture, etc. I can see that comparison. And I also think that does this game and also maybe Sekiro a little bit of a disservice. I think the real brilliance of how this game uses parrying is that it basically fuels everything else. So every time you successfully parry an enemy, it fills up the meter, which allows you to use Ku's abilities. And Ku's abilities are very similar to like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you press a button and it brings up this hotbar of options, and then you can choose one, and then Ku will use that ability. You'll also start to get different swords, which have different perks attached to them, which will activate on successful parries, and they range from things that are like do poison damage or like vampirism, where you take health from an enemy and then it gives it back to you, to more practical stuff like, just more enemy knockback when you hit them. As you start to upgrade your equipment and your abilities and Ku's abilities, I think players, at least I found, you'll find yourself like expressing yourself more creatively through the game's combat. Like the more options it gives you, the more fun it gets, and the more I started to engage with it, at least. I think you will probably have a very different build than I have. But even with that, I think, there are a lot of conversations around this game calling it a Sekiro-like. And I think the less you treat it like Sekiro and the more you start to meet it where it's at, the more you'll probably start to like it. If you start comparing it to Sekiro, I think you're going to be disappointed. And if anything, this is more of a Nier Automata-like. And I don't want to say much more than that about that. No spoilers. But even though I really like it, that doesn't mean I don't have qualms with it. Obviously, there's all the stuff about the first 5 hours, which I think are just like paced pretty brutally. But even stuff like the game has 2 eating systems. Like there's the one on the Cleanse Walker I talked about, which is like earnest and rewarding and brings you closer to your companions, and I think that's really great. But also when you're out traversing the world, there's a second hunger meter, which I get why it's there. Like the idea is you go back to your campsites and you can eat rations, which will fill up your hunger meter. And then also if you find like fish, or if you beat a malefact and it drops meat, you can like cook it and then eat that, and then that'll refill your hunger meter. The idea of the hunger meter, I think, is to force you to go back to the Cleanse Walker so they can show you all the cutscenes and all the story progression stuff that happens when you go back and forth between the regions and the Cleanse Walker. But also, like, the food fills you up so much and they give you so much of it that it kind of is meaningless. Like, it takes so long for the hunger meter to drain, and then also each bit of food fills it up so much that it doesn't really matter. Like, I think it's like a completely meaningless system that's just kind of there as like more of an annoyance than anything. Like, you will probably forget it's there more often than not until a little pop-up shows up that's like, Emma is starving, and then you need to worry about it. And even then, it's like, go find a campsite and eat a fish. There's also this one mode that's on by default that's called cinematic cutscenes, which puts all the cutscenes in 24 frames per second, which I'll just say, I played this on the PS5. It does not look good, especially when you're going from the cinematic cutscenes in 24 frames per second, and then it does the like classic video game thing where you go from the cutscene into gameplay and it snaps from 24 to 60, and you're like, dude, why does it look like this? And one last thing, which I almost like hesitate to touch on, but graphically, I think the game is very beautiful. Like, I think the art direction in this game is absolutely gorgeous. I really love, especially once you get further into the game and the enemy variety starts to like ramp up and they start to get like weirder and weirder with some of the stuff that you're fighting, which is always great. Some of the textures are like pretty rough. Like, it reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy VII. Everybody was talking about like the doors that were just like JPEGs. Like, every once in a while they'll have something really close to the camera that just like doesn't look very good or looks very JPEG-y or whatever. This is not a thing that bothers me at all, but like, it's noticeable, and I do think some people will probably find that to be a huge turnoff. But generally speaking, I think the game like looks and plays and runs really well, so I don't really have any issues with that, but it's worth mentioning probably. I think the truth about this game is that it's just like not for impatient people, which I don't mean as a way to disparage impatient people. I just think there are a lot of people who will walk away from this game thinking that it's like boring and slow and will not get past the first chapter or even the second chapter. And then there will be a whole contingent of people who get into chapters 3, 4, 5 and onwards who like love it and start going to bat for it. And that's where it stops being, a thing that was a potential classic because of like intentionality and decision making on Game Freak's end that led it to that point, and starts to become what I think it will become, which is a cult classic. I think this game is going to be cult classic for a lot of people. There are some people who will say that this is their favorite game of all time, and they will really go hard in the paint in like comments and Discord forums and things like that, just talking about how much they love this game and how they wish there was a sequel. Who knows if there will be one or not, but I just mean like there will be people talking about this game a long time from now. In the same way, like when Nier Automata came out, it wasn't an immediate success but then kind of became a beloved thing over time. I could see that happening with Beast of Reincarnation, if I'm being totally honest. And personally, I had a great time with this game. I loved it. I thought it was good. I would recommend it to people with all of the caveats I have listed already in this video. It's interesting. It was a total surprise for me, if I'm being honest. And it's not very often that I have a complete turnaround on a game like I did with this one, which is why I wanted to make this video in the first place. But that's going to be it. Thank you so much for watching this one. It's worth mentioning I got a code for this game from the publisher's PR, so thank you for that. But also, if you want to support the channel, like, comment, subscribe, do all the things that people tell you to do. Share this video with somebody if you think they're interested in Beast of Reincarnation. You want to give them a heads up about what the experience is probably going to be like. And if you really want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/wavelengths. There's a lot of stuff up there for patrons, including, as of right now, the time I'm posting this video, my first 3 hours with the game I uploaded there. So you can go check that out. Bye, everybody.